good day to the Caron YouTube audience, and another greetings to those of you who are with me and us in person, and then anybody who might be watching on campus on our closed circuit, also good morning to you. I began my recovery with suffering that is so endemic to what it means to be connected in some way to Caron Treatment Centers. This place is a place where people come in brokenness and come back often to celebrate a miracle of transformation and healing that we call recovery. It's a wild and amazing and precious thing. And by no means is it guaranteed, but what we've come to appreciate is that the things that we do here contribute to make that transformation more and more probable. And so the wonderful thing is if you are a current patient or a loved one who is here today, we can tell you that we have the greatest hope for you, perhaps whatever hope we have ever held, that you might be able to be just at the beginning of an incredibly positive turn. And the way I want to ask you to allow me to think with you for the next few minutes of this message about that transformation is in relation to the topic for today, which come up in rotations, of freedom. And by implication, the antithesis of freedom, which I think is captivity. And it's sort of an obvious connection, but also I will say where that connection was made for me quite literally in my early recovery was in literature and in the cultures of the 12-step recovery movements, principally for me, AA and Narcotics Anonymous. And for those of you who know those worlds, I apologize for the elementary introduction, but for those who don't, AA was the very first of the peer movements that fostered successfully tons of people moving out of the captivity of addiction and into sustained recovery. And then in the 1950s, Narcotics Anonymous was one of its first offshoots that sought to use the same kind of tools and models and ideas and apply them to a wider category of use disorder than alcohol primarily or alone. And in my early sobriety, which began in 1989 and then into the 1990s, I straddled those two programs as a way of getting myself started. And it sounds like I knew what the heck I was doing, but I just sort of shipwrecked on the shores of these programs, and they were really nice to me and really helped me get 1 and then 2 days and then 7 days and then a week, and I started collecting the NA keychains and the Alcoholics Anonymous medallions, which are milestone markers of progress in these journeys. And there was a document that is a quotation from the main literature of the AA movement that first came across my awareness early on in my recovery as a separate piece of paper titled The Promises. And I'm guessing that a bunch of you have seen or know this document. And often when you see it, it's actually they're enumerated 1, 2, 3 through 12, but they weren't written that way. They were just written as several paragraphs in the midst of the literature. But the lead promise of the promises of AA in that section of the book is a new freedom and a new happiness. And I think there's information in there about how this is a different freedom than other freedoms that we may have aspired to. And I actually think the addicted person may, like I did as a brat, as a child, I wanted freedom. I wanted freedom from parental stupidity. And I thought of it as exactly that. I thought adults were basically dumb, and I thought the rules that my parents were putting in place were just absurd, and that they didn't get it, and I was much smarter than they were, and certainly like social structures and all that stuff. I was a brash, arrogant, naive fool. And this was something I carried with me into my early recovery, was needing to learn more about what freedom could mean. And before I have a bunch of things I'm hoping to say without chewing up our whole tablet time. So another thing I wanted to say was that in Narcotics Anonymous, I heard through the rivalry that existed at that time, especially between the NA and the AA crowds, was that NA distinguished itself by saying, oh, AA has a ton of promises. We have one promise. And NA's one promise was freedom from active addictions. Just that's like the thing, right? That's what I was hoping for. And that's why I sought help from these communities, and that they were telling me that I could have a new freedom and a new happiness, and that part of the freedom at an essential basis that I would have would be freedom from active addiction was enough for me to be riveted and to want these things to materialize in my life. Over the course of time, I would be challenged. First of all, I'm one of these people, I say this almost every Sunday. I went from atheism to identifying as a person of faith. Weird transformation. And in that journey, I ended up in seminary and feeling called to professional ministry. And that was a journey of transformation and education and formation and deepening of who I am as a person. And along the way, tons of people have helped me. One of them that I shout out fairly frequently from this vantage point is a guy named Kendall Solomon. And Kendall, I've told this story before. If you were to go back and watch other chapel YouTubes of me on the subject of freedom, you would hear me talk about Kendall in greater detail. But one of the things that Kendall called me to understand was that freedom, in the way I was previously understanding it as a brat, was an immature idea of freedom that wouldn't serve me well in the long term. And that theological freedom meant that there was this other way of interpreting freedom, was freedom from unhealthy things and freedom to pursue or attach oneself to that which one desires or idealizes. So freedom from addiction and freedom for good. Freedom from addiction and freedom for, meaning. So it's a trade. And in Christian theological circles, we find the writer Paul talking about being aware that freedom was a bit of an illusion, and that the only thing was, who would I give my allegiance to? And and this was presented to me by Kendall as a more mature understanding of freedom. And by the way, that's one of my hot buttons, is all you need to do to get me a little bit heat-provoked is call me immature. So, and I'm not trying to really do that to you, but anyway, I'm trying to invite your excitement by thinking about wanting to be mature thinkers about freedom. And it's a manipulation. And in order to do that, the question becomes, to what would you want your allegiance pointed? And all that is background for me to today, which is a certain Sunday it's the first Sunday in the season of spring in the year 2023. And I have been really asking myself questions and praying and struggling to get to this very second, because it's been a difficult week for me and for many of us in this room, and for reasons that some of which I think are known and others may not be known. But anyway, it's been a crappy mental health week. That's what I'm going to say. It's been a week of tremendous, profound suffering. And that skewed my thinking around freedom in a certain way that I'm paradoxically grateful for. Story or two. There was a time in my life when one of the closest people to me was captive in a phenomenon that is called by the mental health professionals like acute clinical depression. There's probably a word that I can attach to it, like it's prolonged, chronic, acute clinical depression. Anyway, I was up close and personal with a person who was profoundly, acutely, clinically depressed at one time in my life. And being a spectator and an immediate shockwave experiencer of that phenomenon, the metaphor I thought of on my drive up here this morning was to tell you, I felt like at times I was, that this person was incarcerated. This is not true, but sort of metaphorically true, that they were incarcerated, and that my attempt to penetrate the wall was like going to visit a person in prison. And you know, we see this depicted in the movies and television all the time, where you go in, and I actually have visited people in prison, but usually when I visit people in prison, it's a little more humane like this, and there's like a common area, or I'm bringing the 12-step meeting in. But anyway, I just saw this depiction just the other day, and where there's a glass wall, and you have you have to pick up a phone, and you'll see the typical thing is that people put hands to the glass wall to try and touch, or it's like, screw you, I'm hanging up and I'm leaving. And the inability to have intimacy, other than through this pane of glass and with this phone to the ear, was how I felt next to this person who was in the dark, who was impenetrably absent, not just from me, but from the world around which we were experiencing the day-to-day. And so to talk about freedom and think about that form of mental illness made me think, wow, like, I don't know, I'm like subject to too much Lord of the Rings or Game of Thrones, sort of stuff, and I want to think about freedom and captives as, like national and political and boundaries and fights and disputes out there, but there is a war that happens inside people's minds and in their bodies and in their souls that makes them captive. I have also learned about a phenomenon that my colleagues here who are mental health credentialed in a different way than I am call anxiety disorders. And I've seen that, and don't raise your hands, but I'm sure a bunch of you know what this can be like to varying degrees. It's a continuum from mild to moderate to severe. And it's short-term, medium-term, and long-term. And it's just progressively more and more awful the worse you get out on those scales. But one of the phenomena that I've also seen with the anxiety thing is the cruelty of an anxious experience causing the person to become anxious about being anxious again. So if you have like a major meltdown in panic, first of all, you may be terrified, when will this end? Will I ever get out of it? Will I ever feel anything sort of like baseline normal again? And then as soon as baseline normal sort of arrives, and maybe it's a sunny day, and I'm like, oh, but there's a tiptoe, because it's like, when is that crap going to revisit me? And so now I'm anxious about being anxious. And this too is a form of captivity. This is like the person who has been tormented covertly or overtly and fears that the tormentor is around the next corner all the time. This exhibits itself in a phenomenon that we call PTSD. I'm not schooled in all the particulars of this, but I know what it is when people talk about having a flinch response. Like a loud noise will cause them to cascade into some moment of terror. And if these aren't forms of captivity, then I don't mean to disrespect them, but then if it doesn't feel like captivity to you, I would plead with you to understand, to me, they really are. This is, mental illness is a real imprisonment that is around us all the time. I've been struck so many times by the loneliness of what it is to be a human being and the fragile bridge that we call language and the way that music can do more to bring us together. And so often our music is either I love you or I'm hurting in here, right? And we use the music as a conduit to try and span the chasm of difference and distance between ourselves and the other. But the very loneliness of what it is to be a human being is also sort of like I'm imprisoned in this freaking shell, and you're judging me based on what you see, and my like blah 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 blah. And there's people in the room who are like, he's weird, and and gray hair, and like whatever, and and dude in a dress, right? I'm the Aerosmith, right? And But how would it be possible for me to have you know what it really is like in here and in here. It's really, really difficult. And two other things. One is that I have a colleague, a treasured, adored colleague, who is another person who this week has taken a blow to the soul in their own world that is of immense proportion. And we were talking not long ago about the recovery phenomenon and about mental health and about how fragile human beings are in life and the gift of recovery. What is the gift of recovery? And my friend, her first name is Meredith, some of you know her, and Meredith was pitching to me the idea that those of us who experience this liberation, this freedom to not live in the shackles of the till, to quote the song, are experiencing something revolutionary in our lives. That was her word. This is a revolution in our lives. And there's a world out there that needs this revolution. And that we have a calling, not just to be content with the gift that we have received in having been liberated by others, but to seek to be agents of freedom for other people still. And that if you don't hear it, here's my shofar. This is part of my message today is a call to those of you who either have or are or will find yourself on the other side of the frozenness, experiencing your own capacity to find intimacy and share it and to not be trapped by the sad. I'm going to tell you, depressive experiences and thoughts will revisit us, and anxiousness is not going away. It's wired into our biology. Both of those things are wired into our biology. But the crippling captivity of it can abate. And there are people here who know what it's like to find our way out of those prisons and to help. We know how to help one another if we know that there is help needed. Thank God. So, a call to the revolution is a piece of that puzzle. And then the other thing I was thinking about is what kind of revolution do I really believe in? And one of the sad, tragic truths in human history is that good and evil and right and wrong and the just and the unjust watershed is messy. And sadly, often what happens is that a person who is perpetrated against, in seeking to overcome the perpetrator, re-perpetrates, right? We injure the injurer, and then we become like fiercely, ferociously protective of like, I'm gonna take you down if you try to bring me or my loved ones into captivity ever again, right? There's a defensiveness and so how does one leave this trap of righteous indignation and superiority and justice and injustice just repeating itself over and over again? Well, there are two people in history that come to my mind who have called us on the stage of human history, and I'm sure there are others, but this is, again, not necessarily my center of expertise, but I'm thinking of Mahatma Gandhi and the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., who call us as human beings to be aware of what was called nonviolent resistance. And the notion that we can be revolutionary with peace and love, rather than with I'll kick your ass as our method. And it's, I would argue, more courageous, more difficult, easy to question whether this power is sufficient to overcome the adversity that we face. But there is something that is unbelievably powerful about paths of nonviolent resistance. My friend and colleague Matt back there and I were exchanging messages the other day about compassion in Buddhism. And this is at the heart of this extraordinary peace-loving tradition. And that's a beautiful place to look if you want to see how compassion and peace can inhabit a movement and bring a chill and calm in the context of chaos. So my hope and prayer coming up the mountain today was not only to issue an invitation and a plea, but to set forth for us as that plea an agenda. And the agenda is one that has always been articulated here on Magic Mountain, which is for us to love one another until we can come to love ourselves. And I'm not saying I'm saying anything really new. I'm not even saying anything new at Caron. But I do know that we have not done this perfectly. We have not. We will continue to miss on this. We will not always know when people are behind the curtain and chained in whatever form of captivity and misery they are captive. But I do believe the greatest power to seep through those walls and infiltrate with healing rescue is love and not war. I know I sound like a hippie. I'm perfectly happy with that, by the way. And we're going to finish with a Beatles tune, which is just perfect. But in this moment, if you are in distress and you are shouldering the burden of something inside that others do not know, let us love you until you can understand. If you are anxious and I know it takes a risk to believe that it could be safe to let someone be with you. And if you are in despair, I say prayers every morning. This will be my close. And one of the prayers I said this morning, when I said it, I was like, this is it. It's a prayer that is rich in the recovery tradition, and also comes out of the Christian tradition, although it's nicely not terribly explicitly Christian for those who may prefer to not be deep known. It's most often referred to the prayer of St. Francis. Do you know it? Anyway, make me an instrument of peace. Where there is hatred, may I bring love. Where there is doubt, faith. Where there is despair, hope. Where there is injury, the spirit of forgiveness. Where there are shadows, light. Grant that I may not seek so much to be consoled as to console, to be understood as to understand, to be loved as to love. For it is in self-forgetting that one finds. It is in forgiving that I am forgiven, and it is in dying that I awaken to eternal life. I'm grateful to breathe and breathe with you. I'm grateful to be and be with you. May we be instruments of peace in a troubled world.